There's a lot of fuss, there's a lot of many crowds, there's a lot of excitement and interest in COP26 in Glasgow. And I'd suggest that in the middle of all that fuss, there are at least two strands. One is comfort and one is challenge. So there's all sorts of words and ideas that we're being faced with. Words like movement, challenge, crisis, justice. What I think the strand of comfort is that in amongst this, experts are telling leaders that there are ways the climate crisis can be dealt with. But on the other side, there's a strand of challenge, that this is a crisis, and for something to happen that moves the whole thing forward to the way people are hoping, there needs to be a response, there needs to be a reaction. And not in the future, but now. In the story we're wrestling with, in fact, in the whole collection of books that we call the Bible, there is always a huge theme about response and reaction. And we're looking at one particular story that's one of 4 stories of the life and death and resurrection of a man called Jesus of Nazareth. And he's someone who demanded a reaction. And in a story that we call Luke, we are hearing about the ways that he wandered around in the north of his country, Israel, in the first century. And he drew reactions as he did 2 different things. As he taught, or as he spoke, but also as he lived out the kind of things he did, in particular the ways he helped people and the healings he's performing. They're starting to draw crowds, and these crowds are full of a mixture of different people, those who are just desperate for help and those who are kind of in charge in different ways, either as part of the Roman Empire or as the religious leaders of the day, and they're worried about what he's doing. Luke tells us in chapter 6 that there's a point where Jesus takes a whole night to pray. And that's a theme that Luke wants to keep coming back to, that Jesus is a man of prayer, that what he's doing is rooted in this connection with the God of creation. And what it seems Jesus is preparing for in this particular moment is to choose 12 people. 12 people that he then chooses to be, as he calls, disciples. And at that point it means a learner, a follower, a student, but more than that, people he's chosen to be with him. He also calls them apostles, which has a sense of being a messenger, somebody sent out. And it looks like in this story, with this man, Jesus of Nazareth, who so much centres around, he's not going to do everything himself. Instead, what happens is he's going to build this movement, first of all on these 12 people, but then on a much wider group of people than anyone had imagined so far in the story. Luke's book is a collection of stories, accounts, eyewitnesses of Jesus in action. It was collected together to be then read out to groups of Jesus followers as they wrestled with what it meant to be part of this movement in the face of where they lived and the time they lived. As they heard this, they would hear a story about a man who is Jewish, a man who is going up a mountain and who's choosing 12 people, and they would see echoes of their own Jewish story. Because that story is a God who chose a man called Abraham and then on his family. And these 12 tribes became symbolic of the whole of God's people. People who were chosen to be part of what God was doing, who were saved from slavery in a story called Exodus, and then given a way to live on a mountain. So a mountain and 12 means that this Jesus story is echoing what God's been doing with his people, and maybe in a way now putting it back on track in a new way. A project that is about putting God's creation back on track. Sounds very familiar when we're thinking again about Glasgow and about what's being highlighted in COP26. Luke then goes on, after the choosing of these 12 people, to say, here's the kinds of things that Jesus was teaching. Because Jesus speaks to the 12, but also there are other folk around hearing the kind of things he says. He starts, Jesus, with 4 blessings and then 4 warnings or woes. First of all, words of comfort, and then words of challenge. Before we get into these particular words, it's worth remembering again that Luke has let us know that Jesus has talked about himself living out what God's project is all about. And that project is about God who wants partners in what he is doing. It's a Jewish story about how his people actually keep messing up. But here, Jesus chooses 12 on a mountain and he starts to explain what God is all about, just like that Exodus story where Moses heard from God how his people were to live. So what does Jesus say? He says, "Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." And that word blessed is an interesting word in the Greek. It's the word makarios. And it doesn't mean well done, it's great to be poor. Instead, the word is kind of congratulations. Congratulations if you are currently suffering because you're poor, because God's kingdom, where God is at work, is for you. In other words, the sense is not well done for being poor, that's what we want. It is God is working where people are poor. And that's always been the sense in the story, that God hears the cry of the oppressed, that God has good news for the poor, that God's project has been the renewal of all things, putting the creation project back on track, in fact, bringing it to the flourishing it's supposed to with, dealing with injustice. So these are words of comfort. Congratulations, you who are currently suffering because you're poor, because that's where God is going to be at work, and God will sort that out, and Jesus is at the center of that. As Jesus goes on and he describes 4 situations, he's not describing 4 different kinds of people who are all doing the right kind of thing. Instead, he's talking about the kind of people who need comfort, and the kind of people who are in this situation often because they are his followers. He's talking what it's so often like to be a Jesus follower, part of this project, because there's pushback, because there's opposition. Because another way of life, the empire way of life, is challenged by living this kind of way. And so the poor and the hungry are seen in the empire as being losers. So it's totally shocking for Jesus to be saying congratulations to them. But so often Jesus' disciples do find themselves poor and hungry and weeping and criticised. Why? Because their whole way of life goes against this empire way of life. At that time, the Greek and the Roman culture. But an empire way of life that's come round again and again in the story of God and his people. About grabbing, about riches, about pleasure, about consuming, about being entertained, about exhausting all the resources around you in the world while you can. In the Jewish story, a man called Moses passed on to them a way of life on a mountain, a way of life that was different, distinct from the ways of the broken world around them. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing again. He's talking about a complete reversal, something that's upside down as far as they're concerned, something that's shocking, a direct challenge to a destructive way of life. Which is then why Jesus comes to warnings. He says, woe to those who are rich, or those who are well fed, or those who laugh at others, or those who are only interested in what others are saying about them. What he's saying is mocking the values of the day. He's saying these are false. These are temporary. These are short-sighted. These are unsatisfying. This empire world is full of promises. Buy this, subscribe to that, vote for this, sample this, laugh at that, enjoy it while you can, and forget about everybody else. But it's all smoke and mirrors. And that's why Jesus mentions in there the prophets, who just talk about God's way of life, and the false prophets and their false promises. This is not, he says, what real life is about. This is not what we were made for. This is not what God's creation project is all about. There is another way, regardless of whether people think it's upside down or not. That is the strand of comfort in what Jesus' way was about. It's about something deeper. It's about something longer term. It's about something that involves sacrifice. It's about something at the end of the day that is far more productive and satisfying. It's at heart about joining in with what God is doing, to play our part in being who we were made to be, helping to bring this creation project to its fruition, to its fulfillment, a movement of love and justice and service and hope and promise. Words, actions of comfort, and words and actions of challenge. Comfort and challenge. Which of these do I need, do we need the most right now?